We've spent the morning talking about the dangers of centralized control and an overreaching government and what a profound effect it can have on society. Now we should ask the question, can big government be stopped? James Antle is the author of a new book, Devouring Freedom. He's the editor of Daily Caller News Foundation and a senior editor at The American Spectator. He's also a contributing editor to American Conservative. He frequent guest on television and radio, and he resides in Virginia, so close by. I want you to welcome James Antle, the author of Devouring Freedom, Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, thank you, first of all, Eagle Forum and Heritage Foundation for having me to bulwark institutions and fighting for conservative principles in a country that often seems to have forgotten about them. So my book, Devouring Freedom, is a book that asks the question, can big government ever be stopped? And the focus of it is really, what are the political prospects for limited government? We've talked about limiting the federal government for a very long time, yet we don't seem to, as a movement, and the Republican Party as a political party, have made a lot of headway in that direction. And, a couple of summers ago, Barack Obama promised us a summer of recovery, which didn't pan out so well. But I think this summer has really been the summer of big government. We've seen through exposures, through various leaks, a lot of details emerging about the national surveillance program and the extent to which ordinary Americans are ensnared in the data mining and the surveillance that is supposed to be going on to protect the country. We have seen a lot of the flaws that are inherent in Obamacare. We've watched the implementation of the Affordable Care Act sort of creak and moan, and we've seen sort of this train starting to run off the tracks. And I think we're starting as a country to see what's in store for us as this health care law unfolds. Nancy Pelosi said that we needed to pass the bill to find out what was in it. The Obama administration, Jay Carney yesterday in a press conference promised that once all the different provisions of the bill kicked in, we were really going to like it. But so far that doesn't seem to be the case, and we are starting to see they're delaying provisions of the law. So even as the Obama administration is finding out what's in it, they don't seem to like it very much. So that's sort of been a problem. And I think overall, with the sequester and all of the the horrifying predictions that were made about how the economy was going to collapse if we had this sequester, and airplanes wouldn't be able to fly, and school buildings would all be bulldozed, and everybody would lose their jobs, and we've sort of not seen many of those dire predictions come to pass, and we've seen that maybe government can survive a little bit of a diet. So in this summer of big government, I think we need to ask ourselves, is there anything that we could do to sort of begin to roll it back? And the sequester, obviously, while a nice start, is certainly completely inadequate to the job of containing massive federal spending. We're talking about number one, we're talking about simply reducing the rate of the growth of government. We're not talking about cutting government when we really talk about the sequester, except for there are some actual defense cuts. So the only thing that is really being cut in normal terms, as in terms of actually spending less money, is actually a constitutional function of the federal government. But the unconstitutional functions of the federal government are not really being cut. But even within the confines of how Washington defines spending cuts, we're talking about really 2 cents on the dollar. And even that is spread out over a very long period of time. So if we're talking about rolling back big government, it's going to require something a lot more than the sequester. But before we even can talk about can big government ever be stopped, a lot of people want to ask, what is big government? Do we have a big government? I would argue to you that we have a very big federal government. Between 1787 and 1987, we never had a federal budget that crossed the $1 trillion threshold. In 1987, we finally had a $1 trillion federal budget. It only took us 15 years. It took us 200 years to get to $1 trillion. It only took us 15 years after that to get to $2 trillion as the size of the federal budget. It only took us to 5 years after that to get to the first $3 trillion federal budget. Now we run budget deficits annually that are $1 trillion. We have had deficits as large, almost as large, as what the entire federal budget was as recently as when Bill Clinton was president. I'd argue to you that's a pretty big government, and that's an unhealthy trajectory in government growth. And unfortunately, we crossed all of those trillion and $2 trillion and $3 trillion thresholds while we had Republican presidents. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. A second thing that I would say measures how big of a government that we have is the size of our national debt. We now have a gross national debt that is bigger than the United States economy. I would say that that's a sign of a big government. But even the gross national debt doesn't really measure accurately all of the money that we owe, all of the promises the federal government has made that it doesn't have the money to pay for. If you look at that, we have unfunded liabilities to federal programs, including the major entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, well in excess of $80 trillion. By some measures, our unfunded liabilities are twice the size of the world economy. So I would argue to you that's a pretty big government. So then what do we do in terms of returning to the Founding Fathers' vision of a federal government that was strong enough to protect the United States and defend its interests, but limited in scope, limited by the Constitution, limited in terms of its ambitions and its claims on our lives, on our money, on our options, on our freedoms? Because the case that I make in Devouring Freedom is that big government does take your freedom. Even legitimate functions of government, even things that government needs to do, cost money, takes money out of the private economy, and limits your personal choices. Some of those limits are necessary for society to function. But I'd argue as the government gets too big, grows too large, and becomes too intrusive, the reduction in choices becomes unacceptable and beyond what the founders envisioned. Also, when we have a government that is essentially broke, like the government that we have now, it limits a lot of our political options. There are investments that different levels of government would like to make in things ranging from at the state level and local level education that they can't make because the public employees' pensions, they're paying retired public employees this money instead of being able to provide services for the people who live in their communities. And the federal government, we're starting to see all the discretionary spending in the federal budget be crowded out by the size of the entitlement programs and by the size of the interest on the national debt. So that limits our political options that we can have through our elected representatives as a free people. I think there are three major things that need to happen before we can start looking at rolling some of this back. The first is we need to have a limited government political party. Right now, the Republican Party has been a rhetorically pro-limited government party, and there are, I note in my book, periods where the Republican Party has lived up to this rhetoric. The three historical periods I note are during the Truman administration, what they called the Do-Nothing Congress under Robert Taft, the Congress that came in with Ronald Reagan when he was elected in 1980, and the first year or two of the Gingrich Congress that came in 1994. Most of you are a little younger than me, or quite a bit younger than me, but I always used to joke, you know, the NAC only had one good album, and the Gingrich Congress really only had 2 good years when it came to actually trying to cut government spending. But we need, if we're going to actually have limited government in this country, a political party that actually advocates limited government. We have a political party in the Democrats that are certainly not shy about advocating for much bigger government. And President Obama is very unapologetic in saying that there really aren't other institutions in American life that keep us together besides a big federal government. Now, that's obviously not true. There are churches, there are community organizations, there are families. The free market is a thing that we all do together. But that is a vision of government that's embraced by the Democratic Party. There needs to be something that stands against that. So that brings me to my second point. The second thing that we need is to continue